Hello everyone, it's Ren here speaking. I hope you're doing well and welcome to my room. Today we're going to be having a chat about what Jung says about NI users, particularly NI dominants' ability to predict the future and to see through things. Because I know that this is a feature that is treasured by a number of people. It's useful to have a slightly more closer look at what is really involved. Now, before I start this video, don't forget that you can get my book on the INFJ type, the Ecstatic Soul, the deepest investigation of the INFJ you can find online if you want to deepen your knowledge of the type, particularly through an exploration of the particular quality and experience of the INFJ consciousness. All the links are available in the description box below to all the Amazon websites. If you can find your link, just drop me a comment and I'll get back to you. It's available for less than $10 in ebook and paperback format. So, and also don't forget you can support me on Patreon. I'm still looking for support. So the link is also in the description box, just in case. Right, so I was thinking about the descriptions of NI in Jung's works recently, and I even made a video about it, but it then occurred to me that I could go a little bit further and try to give you a boiled down summary of how Jung conceives of the NI dominance ability to see the future, predict the future. I think it's an important endeavor to engage in, because this is a feature that is so much a part of the INFJ mythology and the INTJ mythology, and perhaps besides the mythology, the descriptions of INFJs and INTJs as being very good and very skilled at reading people. Now, Jung had slightly different things to say about the introverted intuitive, as he calls the NI dominant. And honestly, if you read his detailed accounts of the introverted intuitive, you will not actually encounter descriptions where he says specifically that the introverted intuitive is particularly skilled at reading people, and certainly he doesn't say that the introverted intuitive is skilled or gifted with an ability to tell what people are going to do or what people are thinking and predict what is going to happen from one day to the next. He does not say this, and this notion, I'm not afraid to say, it doesn't make sense. It might be something that some INFJs or wannabe INFJs like to tell themselves. They like to think that they are of the INFJ type, rightly or wrongly. And on that basis, they tend to sometimes, of course, by no means all of them do that. In fact, a minority do. But it's a visible minority who like to self-describe as, as a kind of psychic or seer and able to see things that are about to happen. It's notoriously not the case that Jung says anything like this. Oh, the sun is... my enemy, the sun, is appearing again. So I'll try to see. Maybe I'll use the curtain again to try to protect myself from its assault. Right. So, if I sit back a little bit like this, I should be okay. Yeah. So what a shame. It's sunny every day in the south of France, and it's causing a plethora of problems. Now, Jung does say things about NI dominance ability to predict the future in some sense, but we really have to try and pin down what he really means by this, because it's nowhere near as simple and straightforward as people tend to think. So the first thing that we need to do is to understand that what Jung means by introverted intuition. His definition, once again, is more erudite, but also arcane than the definitions that we understand NI by nowadays, partly because of his own erudition and his the fact that he was a professional psychologist, but also because he was at a stage where he was coming to grips with the very first articulation of intuition as a cognitive function, both extroverted intuition and introverted intuition. What Jung is very clear about is that the primary trait of intuition is that it enjoys priority of perceptual access to the contents of the unconscious. Okay? That's also a useful way of separating, as I indicated in my previous video on Jung's understanding of introverted intuition, to demarcate between what's conscious in introverted intuition, what's unconscious. What's conscious is the normal operational functioning of introverted intuition when it's dominant. What's unconscious is the contents that it is able to access. Now, those contents are not just any contents, they are the structural contents of the unconscious insofar as they constitute the collective unconscious. In other words, these contents are the archetypes or the primordial images. These are contents in the unconscious and they have great influence over our behavior. But that's an important aspect of introverted intuition. Introverted intuition does not access the contents as such, because these contents, these archetypal contents in the unconscious, remain in the unconscious. They cannot show up in consciousness just like that. They show up in consciousness in the form of symbols. The cross, the giving Earth Mother, the water womb, the life-giving sun, and so on and so forth. There's plenty of symbols. You can read some of Jung's books. Man and the Symbols, Symbols of Transformation is another great book that you could read to get more knowledge about the archetypes that Jung identifies in his work. In any case, these archetypes are only accessible to our cognition, that is to say in consciousness, as symbols. And it's very important to remember that for Jung, symbols are not signs. He distinguishes between a sign and a symbol. In other words, a sign could be like, for example, the word cat to designate a cat. The word cat is a sign. It has a clear reference, which is the animal called a cat, right? In some sense, and actually in a very clear sense, this object, is a sign. It's not an actual camel or dromedary with its single hump, but it definitely signifies the animal, right? So this is a sign. Well, for Jung, if you may allow me the simplicity of this example, for Jung, an archetype is not like this. An archetype, or rather the symbol of an archetype, is not something that is representing the archetype as a well-defined, singly identified entity. The archetype is ever dynamic, and the symbol is ever dynamically allowing for the flow of psychic energy between the unconscious and consciousness to facilitate the influence of the archetypes. It's kind of an abstract notion, but that's what Jung means. So introverted intuition, in our case, gives the user a privileged perceptual access to symbols of these archetypes. Now, if the introverted intuitive is able to interpret these symbols in the appropriate way, and Jung himself, an introverted intuitive, by the way, does that in all his books, he may then be able to predict the future. But he does not necessarily know that he or she is predicting the future. What he's doing is he's talking about the symbols that he's able to access in perception. This is exactly what Nietzsche does in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, by the way. I don't know if you guys have read this book. I'm sure you've heard of this book. It's a very, very symbolic work. It's almost entirely made out of allegories and symbolic framing. In some sense, Jung is right to consider that Nietzsche's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is a book that is talking about the archetypes, and that the predictive power of that book and of any introverted intuitive's work when it comes to interpreting the symbolic archetypes that they're able to access in consciousness is to be explained by the fact that these archetypes are universal and constant. They don't change across cultures. That's the meaning of the collective unconscious. It's collective insofar as it spreads across the entire world, across the entire spectrum of humanity. And it doesn't disappear over time. Archetypes are incredibly solid, resilient forms that subsist in our consciousness and erupt in different manners, in different cultures, in different structures and forms that are brought to consciousness and into concrete structures and practices and institutions, but always with the same basic blueprint, the same basic material. Cultures just modulate the manner in which this material is expressed. So introverted intuition's talent and gift is to be able to access through symbols the archetype itself. So insofar as an introverted intuitive is able to interpret those archetypes, of course they might be able to tell what's going to happen in the future, because every culture, every person from every culture, influential, not influential, group, non-group, is going to always be acting in a way that's influenced by these primordial archetypes. So the introverted intuitive is not writing a book to say, I'm predicting that this is going to happen. They're just writing a book describing archetypes that then will provide, possibly in the future, a template to understand what will happen, because what will happen will be a repetition in a different form of the influence of the ever constant and universal archetypes. So you can see that the predictions of introverted intuitives, the prophetic quality of introverted intuitives is not short term, not from one day to the next. It's very, very long term, over dozens of years, hundreds of years, centuries, millennia. We're talking about the very long term, the longue durée, as the French historian Fernand Braudel says. And he or she may be wrong, or at least may have an ability for big prediction that is not immediately identified if they speak in the language of the symbol rather than in the language of a concrete interpretation of the symbol that could later be understood as a prediction. So the myth of an INI dominant being able to read other people or tell what they're going to be doing the next day, that has nothing to do with how Jung describes introverted intuition as a function of privileged access to the symbolic form of the archetypes. We're always, in the case of NI, talking about the universal and the very long term. And it's only in this symbolical, indirect fashion that NI dominance can be considered visionary. Let me know what you think in the comments, guys. Drop me a like and consider subscribing. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.